Okay, so when last we left, Khrushchev had just uh, authorized the launching of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. So we're going to move forward a couple of years here from 57 roughly to about 59 or 60. Um, and I want to start off by sort of emphasizing why Sputnik being launched was such a big deal. Initially, it wasn't, right? Initially, Korolev and von Braun all thought that it was a big deal, but nobody in charge did. Eisenhower didn't, and Khrushchev didn't. Khrushchev just thought that it might be a minor propaganda victory, and so when he gets the initial word that the Soviets have launched the first artificial satellite into space, he makes a comment about it to the people he's around. He was at a party. Um, but it seems like it was just a passing comment. It wasn't something that was fundamentally game changing. Um, over the next couple of days, I mean, Eisenhower hears about this, and again, he's also not that much affected. He knew where the Soviet technology was, and he knew their capabilities weren't as good as the United States, right? He knew that the United States could have launched a satellite had they chosen to do so. But over the next couple of days, it begins picking up steam all around the world that the Soviet Union fired a satellite into outer space. This was the first thing ever launched into outer space by humans, and it was in orbit. And furthermore, it was visible to anybody that wanted to see it. So you could go outside, and if you had a telescope or binoculars, you could see a star where there had been no star before, and it was moving relatively quickly across the sky. I don't know if you've seen satellites, but they move more quickly than any other object in the nighttime sky. So it's really disconcerting if this is the first thing you've ever seen. Um, keep in mind, it's always tricky to imagine this because, you know, we live in the present. Um, but 1957, there was not that much pollution everywhere in the world, right? Like in New York City, you probably could have seen more stars than you can see in Reno right now. So you could go out and see stars. You could see the nighttime sky, and people did. It was fun. In fact, I grew up in New Mexico, and I remember as a child looking up in the nighttime sky and thinking it was beautiful. So the United States can see an object that they didn't put up that caught them off guard, passing by very quickly in the nighttime sky. They had known that the Soviet Union not only had nuclear weapons, but they had thermonuclear weapons. And there had been this threat for a while that they had more bombers than the United States did. They didn't, but a lot of the American populace didn't know that. So to get in the mindset of people living in the suburbs at this time, the United States seemed like it was unparalleled in charge of the world. Maybe communism was a growing threat, but it was weaker and inferior in some sense to the capitalist ideology. And then suddenly everything about them is above the United States is controlled by the Soviet Union, at least in the mind's eye of the people in the US. The United States is a belligerent country. We've, you know, in our 240 years of history, I think we haven't accumulated more than 20 years of peace. And it is a country that, through whatever accidents of history and design of brutal expansion, has no neighbors to the east or west, right? We have giant oceans between us and the nearest neighbor. And our neighbors to the north and south are friends, right? We had a war with Mexico in the mid 1800s. We took most of their land, including the spot where a lot of students are, a lot of you are sitting right now. And Canada, we had a war with them in the early 1800s, but since then we've been peaceful. So the fact that geographically the Soviet Union was used to being surrounded by all sides, but the United States wasn't, made us overreact. I think this might be roughly analogous to how 9/11 made Americans feel vulnerable in the first time since Pearl Harbor, right? Pearl Harbor, Sputnik, 9/11, these are instances where the hegemony of the United States is challenged, and it really, really makes everybody re-examine things. So in the Soviet Union, they are super proud, super excited by what just happened. This is one of the biggest propaganda victories um, of Khrushchev's reign, and it's relatively early into it. And he thinks, oh my God, this is impressive. We've shown that that communism is the mighty ideology that could beat the United States at some scientific prize. We should do it again. In fact, so this is launched October 4th. If you recall, the Bolsheviks had taken over in Russia in November 4th of 1917. So exactly 40 years, 39 years and 11 months before. So Khrushchev says, oh, we should have waited until the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, but it's okay, we have an entire center. Let's just do this again. We never thought that you would launch Sputnik before the Americans, but you did it. Now please launch something new into space for the next anniversary of our revolution. By the way, Sputnik means little traveler. So he just calls up Korolev, who spent months and months working on this one project, and says, do it again, but bigger and better. And Korolev thinks, you know what? Dogs are bigger and better. This is like the first creature. For a long time, we had the legacy of being the first creature launched into space, because she was launched on Sputnik 2 about a month later, November 4th, 1957. Korolev had been launching dogs into low Earth orbit for a long time. He had lots of practice with it. Sorry, not low Earth orbit, low Earth, just launching them up in the sky. And so he thought, okay, I could just do the exact same thing I've been doing, but now launching them into space. They had a month to prepare, and so they didn't have enough time to prepare anything that would have kept her alive. There was no way of retrieving her. So they planned to launch her into outer space. They chose her specifically because she was the nicest tempered. Laika means barker, so a dog who barks. They gave her a nice meal the night before. And then they sedated her, and they put her in the payload of the exact same rocket that launched Sputnik. But this time they put her there, and they launched her up, and we were told in 1957 that she made a couple of orbits and then was euthanized. She actually burned up heading into space. I talk about a lot of horrible things in this class, and the animal cruelty of this moment really affects students. So the next couple of minutes are gonna be bad. I'm just gonna skip ahead to all of the animal cruelty in this in the space section, just so that you can skip ahead if you want to. There won't be any questions on the quiz about the animals, or at least about how they died. I might ask you Laika's name. She's on stamps. Yeah. I had a student once gave me a bunch of these stamps to commemorate these. We'll talk about each of these, right? So Sputnik's the top left. We'll talk about Luna 1 and Luna 3 next, and then the Vostoks 1 through 5, or 1 through 6. It's kind of cool. All right, so we're talking about animals dying. I'm going to include the links in the description here. After this video, just go to each of these links so you can get to see some of the press releases of Miss Baker and all of these other animals that we launched into space. The United States had been launching animals into low Earth orbit for a while. We were intending to see if we could launch humans into space, so animals in the sky seemed an important step. And I'm going to introduce you to a lot of monkeys named Albert. NASA launched one monkey named Albert. It died. Another monkey named Albert. It died. Third, fourth, fifth. The sixth monkey they called Albert, but they nicknamed York. Then they switched codes to Abel. So the reason they launched monkeys named Albert is because A is the first letter of the alphabet. And so they wanted to say, oh, the first monkey we launched, codenamed Albert, later Abel, survived. Eventually, there were two that made it up and back, Abel and Barker. Miss Barker survived many, many, many years after being launched. Miss Baker did. Abel, who, if you clicked on the video in the previous screen, or actually the first link in the description, he actually died shortly after the press conference where they announced he had successfully returned. They were trying to remove an electrode from his brain, and he died during surgery. So anyway, the Americans launched lots of animals into space. When I was a kid, we went to Alamogordo and saw a stuffed chimpanzee that had been launched into space, and that bothered me and stuck with me for a while. Then the United States decided, well, if the Soviet Union can launch a rocket, we've been able to do that since 1956, let's do it. But they didn't want to launch the Jupiter-C Redstone rocket that had been designed by Wernher von Braun, not because he was a Nazi. They didn't seem to really care that he was a Nazi designing the American space program. But they did want to launch something that was not military-based. Eisenhower was glad that the Soviet Union went first, but he still wanted to make a point that military designs had not produced the America's first satellite. So they launched Vanguard, which lasted a couple of seconds and then exploded. You can see the video. There's no humans that die in the video. I'm never going to link to a video where a human dies. I will show still images where there are right before or right after a death. So the United States is embarrassed. It is an international embarrassment. And Khrushchev mocks them. When the United States starts sending support to Turkey, Khrushchev says, be careful, we have rockets and ours work. So it's just like massive shade being thrown. A couple of months later, the United States just doesn't want to have a loss. So they launched the rocket that they had launched 2 years before. Only this time they set the angle so that it can go into orbit. They launched the Jupiter-C rocket. They want to say that they're doing something that's not just for propaganda purposes. So they contact James Van Allen to provide some sort of scientific equipment of some sort that might be interesting to study from space. So very quickly he drafts something up, and we discover in this, the Explorer, by the way, I'm gonna ask you the name, it's Explorer, successful launch, Explorer. I'll also ask you about Vanguard, I think, that sounds right, and Leica. Those are gonna be the quiz questions. We discover that the United States has ionizing radiation enveloping it. Sorry, not the United States. The planet has ionizing radiation enveloping it, which was the very first time that we discovered the magnetic field of Earth. Now we know that the Earth is this giant, basically ball of iron, this giant magnet, and that these belts keep us alive. But at the time, we were worried that we had created them by just detonating nuclear weapons for more than a decade. So we developed a thing called Project Argus, which I'll talk about shortly. The United States was launching satellites. We happened to launch the one that was orbiting the longest and is not going to, the orbit isn't going to decay for another couple of 100 years. Orbits decay. What that means is either something falls toward the Earth or it flings away. And so this is just evidence that we've been doing this. Every satellite will eventually either fly away or fall into Earth. Need to get past that so we can talk about Operation Argus. Again, there's going to be another link in the description about this. Check it out. It's whimsical. We sent aircraft carriers around the world. We were interested in detecting whether the radiation produced by atomic weapons on Earth could get to space. We were interested in seeing whether we could detect radiation in space, whether we could detect whether atomic weapons were launched. The idea was to see if we could have an early warning system in the form of our space program. So this is all 1958. Within a year of Sputnik, there's been many satellites launched on both sides. And the United States decides that they need to actually start formalizing this and creating entities whose entire task is to deal with going into outer space and other technologies that might derive from that. So there's ARPA, which becomes DARPA, focusing on predominantly military applications, developing future technologies. And then there's NACA, which becomes NASA in 1958. And this is a civilian agency. And it really is civilian. Like you, as a tax-paying citizen, have access to every image NASA has ever taken. Right? You can go on their archives and find beautiful images of the night sky. It's great. All right, so in 1957, the United States launched one rocket, the Vanguard, and the Soviet Union launched two, both Sputniks. The United States failed miserably, but the Soviet Union had what they considered successes. 1958, the United States launches many more rockets, including the Vanguard, but also various ones derived from the von Braun Army system. So the Jupiter-C, the Juno, the Thor. The Navy also gets involved in producing their own rocket. So the United States starts launching more rapidly. We're spending more money from the very beginning, despite the fact that the space race seems like it's a big loss for the United States at every point, just because technically the Soviets were doing better. The United States had put a lot of resources into it the entire time. So it would have been a matter of time for the United States to take over, even absent John F. Kennedy's speech trying to motivate the public to go to space, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. 1960, United States is a good, again, representing most of the rockets launched into space. 61, and it keeps going like this, right? So we have more and more rockets that are launched every year. Throughout the 60s, it starts decreasing in the 70s and 80s. Until now, there's relatively few rockets launched. We actually can't even launch humans into space, at least without getting help from Russia or from SpaceX at this point. And we started spending, we always had been spending more money than the Soviets in space technologies, but in the 1960s, it really takes off. We really start spending more money. And the next lecture, we'll talk about why that happened and how. So by 1958, this is a year after the rocket, the Sputnik is launched. And we realize, well, we've launched dogs into space, we've launched monkeys into space. The next thing to do is launch humans. So the United States develops a casting call for astronauts. There's a big gender issue here that is worth pointing out. Arguably, women are better astronauts than men. They are smaller, so on average, so they can get to space cheaper. They're more resistant to G-forces and durable in a lot of ways. But the United States was afraid of killing, to be quite blunt, a woman in space. And rather than wrestle with the issue of whether women should be allowed in the astronaut program, seeing as NASA was a civilian agency, they decided to set a criteria of combat experience, or not combat experience, flying experience with fighter pilots to try to get test pilots involved. The idea being that they were the ones most likely to be able to handle spacecraft in tough situations. And by sheer coincidence, not a coincidence, all of these fighter pilot were men and had to be men. So the United States didn't have their first female astronaut for more than a decade after the Soviet Union did. There were some space requirements, right? None of them could be taller than 5'11". Eventually, there were degree requirements. There was a lot of these requirements, and there's lots of really cool movies about this, right? There's The Right Stuff. If you're into romantic comedies or whatnot, The Astronaut Wives Club is a mini series about these people. These are the Mercury 7 on the left. Carpenter leaves relatively early on. Cooper, John Glenn was still alive when I first started teaching this. He led one of the most fascinating lives. He was the oldest person when this photo was taken, about 40, and he outlived every one of these people. Gus Grissom, don't get too attached to him. He suffers a tragic end. He's a good guy, but he suffers a tragic end. Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard is an asshole, also the first American in space. Deke Slayton suffers a medical issue which sidelines him so that he becomes in charge of administering rather than being an astronaut, although he does eventually get to go into space. On the right is the Sochi 7. The Soviets decided to find their own hyper competent pilots. So in the center is Korolev. To his left is Gagarin, probably the most famous person in the 20th century for a decade or so. One of these people that's hyper influential, except the United States tried to downplay his accomplishments. And the rest of these people make appearances here and there, but you know, it's just important that you know that there's you know, it's just Mercury 7 and the Sochi 7. They had roughly the equivalent programs that we did. The Mercury 7, the Sochi 6, as I was saying. So there are 6 of them the entire time. So, you know, just those 6, those 6, those 6. Memento mori. We damnatio memoriae, sorry. Memento mori is remember we die. Damnatio memoriae is damn the memory. The Soviets were very interested in erasing images from circulation if they didn't fit the narrative. Don't feel too superior. We've been doing this in the United States too. Okay, that's the end of that video. Click on the other videos on the links and watch them. And I'll finish these next couple of videos up shortly so we can start talking about more cool space stuff. Have a good day.